What if I told you the date for the Exodus that's in most history books is off by a full 200 years? It's one of the most famous stories in human history, but for centuries, its actual timing has been this huge historical puzzle. Today, we are going to play detective and investigate the evidence that suggests we've been looking in the wrong century this whole time.
So here's the deal. We've got two completely different timelines for the Exodus from Egypt. One is the date you'll probably find in most textbooks, but honestly, it creates a ton of problems and clashes with what archaeologists have found. Then there's this other, much earlier date, one that, well, you'll see. It makes all these historical loose ends just click together perfectly. So let's dig in.
And this gets us right to the heart of it all, the 200-year mystery. I mean, how can historians be so far apart on such a major event? We're not talking about a few years here or there. We are talking about a 2-century gap. That is a massive difference, and which date you pick changes absolutely everything about how we understand this entire period of ancient history.
Okay, so on one side, you have the late date, which places the Exodus around 1250 BC. And on the other side, you have the early date, putting it way back in 1446 BC. That's almost 200 years. That's not just a tiny disagreement. That's the difference between whole dynasties of pharaohs, completely different empires being in charge. It changes the whole picture.
So let's really break these two theories down. You've got the popular late date theory, and it basically hangs its entire argument on one single clue, the mention of a city named Ramesses. It seems pretty solid on the surface, but the early date theory, it relies on something totally different, a direct chronological statement from inside the Bible itself. And this, right here, is where our investigation really kicks off.
The whole late date theory, the one most of us learn about, it really all centers on this guy, Pharaoh Ramses II. You know him as Ramses the Great, and for good reason. This guy was an absolute powerhouse in the 13th century BC. He was famous for his huge building projects, his military victories, and the logic tying him to the Exodus story seems, at first glance, pretty undeniable. Here's why so many historians find this connection so powerful. The book of Exodus says the enslaved Israelites built the store cities of Ptolemy and Ramses, while archaeologists have found the ruins of this huge, magnificent capital city built by Ramses the Great, and it was called P-Ramses. So the thinking goes, he built the city in the 13th century, the Israelites built it, so they must have been there under his reign. Case closed, right?
Well, not so fast. What if that whole argument is built on a single and maybe kind of flawed assumption? Let's try asking a totally different question. Does the Bible itself give us a specific time frame? Does it have its own internal clock that could point us in a different direction? The answer is a huge, emphatic yes. And this brings us to what I like to call the Solomon key. There's this one verse, kind of tucked away in the book of 1 Kings, that gives us a super precise chronological anchor for the Exodus, and it points to a much, much earlier date.
Just look at this verse from 1 Kings chapter 6. It is incredibly specific. It doesn't say a long, long time ago or after many generations. No, it gives a hard number, the 480th year. This is a deliberate historical timestamp, recorded by the ancient writers for a reason.
480 years. A direct, numerical link between two of the most important events in the entire history of ancient Israel, the Exodus from Egypt and the construction of the very first temple in Jerusalem. And the math here is actually super straightforward. Historians and archaeologists are pretty much all in agreement that Solomon started building his temple around 966 BC. So, if we just take the Bible at its word and add that 480 years to the date, boom, you land exactly in 1446 BC. There's no guesswork here at all. So here's our first big takeaway, and it is a crucial one. The Bible's timeline actually works when you follow its own chronology. Instead of starting our search with an assumption about a city's name, we're starting with a direct statement from the text. But now, of course, we have to ask the really big question. Does this brand new date fit the actual evidence in the ground? All right, we have our new date, 1446 BC. Now it's time to put on our detective hats and turn to the hard evidence of archaeology. If this date is right, we should see signs of a major upheaval, a major disruption in Canaan right around 1400 BC, after the biblical 40 years of wandering in the desert. And what do we find? Well, let's start with maybe the most famous city of all, Jericho. Archaeologists digging there have uncovered this incredible, massive destruction layer. The city was violently destroyed, it was burned, and the dating for this event, based on things like pottery styles, points directly to the end of the 15th century BC.
That's a perfect match for an invasion right after a 1446 BC Exodus. And it's not just a one-off thing at Jericho. Let's look at another huge Canaanite city from the story of the conquest, Hazor. And guess what? Just like Jericho, archaeologists at Hazor found a super thick burn layer, clear evidence of a massive violent destruction. And once again, the dating points right to that same exact time period, the 15th century BC. A pattern is definitely starting to form here. Okay, but this is where it gets really interesting. At the exact same time all this is happening, we have what are basically eyewitness reports from Egyptian officials who were stationed in Canaan. They're called the Amarna letters, and they are these frantic messages sent back to the pharaoh describing total chaos and invasions. They complain about a group called the Habiru, who are overrunning all their cities. Now, scholars debate who exactly the Habiru were, but the timing and the name's similarity to Hebrew, it is pretty striking.
And this is that aha moment. When you lay all of this out on the 1446 BC timeline, the pieces just click into place. The biblical date for the Exodus, the destruction of Jericho, the burning of Hazor, and the Egyptian reports of a Habiru invasion, they all line up perfectly in the exact same historical window.
Okay, so if the evidence fits this early timeline so perfectly, we have to go back and solve that original problem. We got to tie up the loose ends. And that means starting with the city that kicked off this whole debate in the first place, Ramesses. So what's the deal with that city name? This actually has a really simple explanation. It was a common practice for ancient writers to update old place names to ones that their current audience would recognize. It's like a modern historian writing that Julius Caesar conquered France when we all know it was called Gaul back then. You used a modern name so people know what you're talking about. The scribe just used the name of the region that his readers would know.
So this simple literary habit completely solves the single biggest objection to the early date, which, leads to a kind of funny conclusion. Sometimes it just seems like history textbooks have a really hard time admitting they might be off by a couple hundred years. It's tough to change a story that's been told the same way for so long.
But what's really incredible is how many other historical puzzles the early date just solves. You know that huge amount of evidence for Semitic people living in Egypt's delta at a place called Avaris for centuries before Ramses II was even born? It fits. The weird sudden disappearance of Asiatic slave workers from Egyptian tomb paintings right after the mid-15th century. That fits too. And of course, the destruction of those Canaanite cities. All the puzzle pieces just come together. It works.
And so we come back to our main point, and it's a really powerful one. The Bible's timeline actually works when you follow its own chronology. The evidence we find in the ground strongly suggests that the biblical authors knew their own history and recorded it with a surprising amount of accuracy.
So this whole investigation leaves us with one final and, I think, pretty profound thought. If all this external evidence lines up so neatly when we simply trust the Bible's internal timeline for the Exodus, it really makes you wonder, what other historical puzzles could we solve just by approaching these ancient texts with a fresh pair of eyes? What else might we be missing?